The thermometer outside Amos Talbot's dugout cabin read 43 degrees below zero on the morning of January 9, 1844. But inside his semi-subterranean dwelling, the temperature held steady at 58 degrees, with only the embers of last night's fire still glowing in the stone hearth. 3 miles down the valley, 7 people had frozen to death in their above-ground cabins during the 6-day blizzard that buried the Montana Territory under 8 feet of snow. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier wisdom move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale of mountain survival is even more unbelievable than this one. The Montana Territory in 1842 was not yet officially organized, simply a vast wilderness west of the Dakota lands where the federal government had minimal presence and even less concern for the handful of settlers attempting to establish homesteads in the mountain valleys. The region attracted a specific type of person, those fleeing debt, scandal, or simply the crowding of more civilized territories to the east. They came seeking land that cost nothing but the labor required to work it, and they accepted the brutal terms that wilderness imposed on those who chose to live beyond the protection of established communities. Amos Talbot arrived in the valley during the summer of 1841 with modest supplies, basic carpentry skills learned from his father in Pennsylvania, and enough savings to sustain himself through 2 winters if necessary. He was 27 years old, unmarried, and possessed the careful, methodical temperament that served men well on the frontier. He was neither reckless nor timid, neither ignorant nor educated beyond practical matters. He understood how to fell trees, square logs, build basic structures, hunt adequately, and preserve food. These skills placed him solidly in the middle range of frontier competence, capable enough to survive under normal circumstances, but not exceptional in any particular way. The valley he selected for his homestead ran north to south between 2 mountain ridges, with a creek providing reliable water and sufficient timber for construction and fuel. Approximately 15 other families had claimed land in the same drainage over the previous 3 years, spread out along 10 miles of creek bottom. This was not a formal town or even a proper settlement, simply a loose collection of isolated homesteads whose inhabitants saw each other occasionally during supply trips to the trading post 40 miles east or during chance encounters while hunting or cutting timber. Cabin construction in 1842 followed patterns established over generations of frontier expansion. Settlers selected sites near water, felled logs of relatively uniform diameter, notched the ends using simple saddle joints, stacked them to create walls approximately 7 to 8 feet high, chinked the gaps with moss and mud, built a door from split planks, cut a small window, or simply left an opening covered with oiled paper or scraped hide, constructed a roof from poles and bark, and built a fireplace from river stone and mud mortar. 2 men working steadily could complete such a cabin in 4 to 6 days. The resulting structure provided shelter from rain and wind, a place to store supplies, and a base for the season's work. It was never particularly warm in winter, never entirely dry during heavy rains, and required constant maintenance, but it met the minimum requirements for frontier habitation. Amos partnered with Cyrus Hadley during his first autumn in the valley. Cyrus had arrived 2 years earlier and occupied a cabin 3 miles upstream. He was 41 years old, originally from Vermont, and had come west after his wife died of fever. He possessed more frontier experience than Amos and understood the rhythms of mountain weather, game migration, and timber selection. The partnership was practical rather than born of friendship. 2 men could build structures faster, hunt more efficiently, and provide security against the occasional hostile encounters that occurred in isolated areas. They constructed Amos's cabin in early September 1841 using the standard methods both men knew. They selected a site 50 yards from the creek on level ground with good drainage. The cabin measured 12 feet by 16 feet internally, providing adequate space for 2 men and their supplies. The walls used logs averaging 10 inches in diameter, notched at corners using saddle joints that Cyrus had cut dozens of times before. They chinked gaps with moss gathered from the forest floor, mixed with clay dug from the creek bank. The door hung on leather hinges and could be barred from inside with a wooden beam. They cut one small window on the south wall and covered it with oiled paper Amos had brought from Pennsylvania. The roof consisted of poles laid across the top logs, covered with overlapping sections of bark, with a layer of sod on top for additional weather protection. The fireplace occupied one corner, built from river stones stacked and mortared with mud. The chimney rose above the roof line, but was crude in construction, just adequate to vent smoke on calm days. They built sleeping platforms along 2 walls, raising them 18 inches off the dirt floor. Simple shelves held supplies. A rough table and 2 stools completed the furnishings. The entire structure took them 5 days to build, working from dawn until dark. Their first winter together proved manageable but uncomfortable. The cabin leaked cold air through dozens of small gaps in the chinking. The door, despite being barred, allowed wind to whistle through the leather hinges and the imperfect fit of planks. The window was a constant source of cold air infiltration. The fireplace drew poorly on windy days, filling the cabin with smoke. On calm, cold nights, the draft reversed entirely, pushing smoke back into the living space. They burned enormous quantities of wood. Amos estimated they cut and split approximately 12 cords during the 5 months between November and March. Even with a fire burning constantly, the interior temperature rarely exceeded 45 degrees on the coldest nights. They slept in their clothes under multiple blankets. Water left in buckets overnight froze solid. Food stores froze unless kept near the fire. They spent their days cutting wood, their evenings huddled near the hearth, and their nights cold despite their efforts. Both men survived the winter of 1841 to 42 without serious incident. They considered this success. Most frontier homesteaders measured winter survival in binary terms. You lived or you died. Comfort was never the expectation. January 1843 brought weather that exceeded normal winter severity. A high-pressure system settled over the northern Rockies in early January, creating clear skies and temperatures that plummeted to levels neither Amos nor Cyrus had experienced. The thermometer Cyrus owned, a mercury instrument he had carried from Vermont, registered 28 degrees below zero on January 7th. The next morning, it showed 34 below. On January 9th, the mercury dropped to 41 degrees below zero. The extreme cold created conditions their cabin could not withstand. The leather door hinges became brittle and cracked. The oiled paper window covering froze and tore. The chinking between logs contracted and fell out in sections, creating gaps that allowed wind to pour through. The fireplace consumed wood at an unsustainable rate, yet the cabin's interior temperature hovered around 20 degrees despite their constant fire tending. Frost formed on the interior walls. Their water supply froze solid. Their breath created ice crystals that fell like snow inside the cabin. On the night of January 10th, the temperature outside reached 46 degrees below zero. Amos and Cyrus burned furniture to supplement their dwindling wood supply. They wore every piece of clothing they owned. They took turns sleeping in 2-hour shifts, one man tending the fire, while the other attempted rest under piled blankets and furs. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, Cyrus complained of feeling tired. He wanted to sleep just a bit longer. Amos noticed his partner's speech had become slurred. He recognized the symptoms of dangerous cold exposure, but had no way to warm Cyrus beyond adding more wood to the fire. Their fuel supply was nearly exhausted. The interior temperature continued dropping despite the flames. By dawn, Cyrus Hadley was dead. He had simply gone to sleep and not awakened. The cold had killed him inside the cabin they had built to protect them. Amos spent that morning alone with his partner's frozen body, watching the fire die down to coals, understanding with absolute clarity that their shelter had failed its most fundamental purpose. The temperature rose to 10 below zero by mid-afternoon. Amos wrapped Cyrus in blankets and dragged him outside. The ground was frozen too hard for burial. He covered the body with stones from the creek, marking the location for proper burial when the ground thawed. He returned to the cabin and sat in the cold structure, staring at the inadequate walls, the failed chinking, the poorly designed fireplace. Something fundamental was wrong with how frontier cabins were built, and Cyrus had paid with his life for that flaw. The death of Cyrus Hadley affected Amos in ways he did not immediately recognize. He continued his daily routines, maintaining the fire, melting snow for water, rationing food supplies, but his attention had shifted from simply surviving winter to understanding why his cabin had failed. The question consumed him. Other settlers had survived in similar structures. Their cabins were no better built than his. What made the difference between life and death in extreme cold? He began systematic observation of his shelter. He mapped every gap in the chinking, marking locations where wind entered. He noticed that gaps near the floor allowed the heaviest cold air infiltration. He observed that the corner joints, despite being notched properly, had settled and separated, creating pathways for wind that no amount of moss and mud could permanently seal. He measured the thickness of his log walls, approximately 10 inches, and realized this provided minimal insulation against sustained extreme temperatures. The window presented an obvious weakness. Even with oiled paper covering, it allowed massive heat loss. The door was equally problematic. The leather hinges, the gaps around the frame, and the simple plank construction created an opening that constantly leaked warm air outward and cold air inward. The fireplace, rather than efficiently heating the space, consumed enormous fuel while sending most heat directly up the chimney and out of the cabin. Amos spent hours studying the fireplace design. He noticed that the straight vertical chimney created strong draft on calm days, but offered no mechanism to reflect heat back into the room. The stone construction absorbed some heat, but the stones were cold on their exterior faces, indicating heat was passing through them rather than being retained. The corner placement meant heat radiated toward one area of the cabin, while the opposite corner remained frigid. He began paying attention to natural shelters. He examined caves in the nearby hillsides, noting their consistent temperature regardless of exterior conditions. He observed animal burrows, recognizing that ground squirrels, badgers, and other creatures survived winter underground without any fire at all. He studied root cellars that settlers dug for food storage, understanding that these underground chambers remained above freezing even during the coldest weather. A pattern emerged in his observations. Everything above ground fought a losing battle against winter wind and temperature extremes. Everything below ground accessed a different thermal environment, one characterized by stability rather than wild fluctuation. The Earth itself, below a certain depth, maintained consistent temperature throughout the year. This was not theory or speculation. It was observable fact that anyone could verify by digging a hole and measuring temperature at different depths. Spring arrived in late March 1843, bringing warmer temperatures and the impossible task of burying Cyrus in ground that had finally thawed. Amos dug the grave on a hillside overlooking the creek and marked it with a wooden cross bearing his partner's name and the year of his death. He spoke no words over the grave, simply filled it and returned to his cabin with renewed determination to understand what had killed his friend. He began experimental excavations to study ground temperature. Using a spade and pickaxe, he dug test holes at various locations around his property. The first hole reached 3 feet deep. Using Cyrus's mercury thermometer, he measured the temperature at the bottom of the hole daily for 2 weeks. The readings remained remarkably consistent, hovering between 46 and 49 degrees regardless of exterior air temperature, which varied from 32 degrees at night to 65 degrees during warm afternoons. He dug a second hole to 5 feet depth. The temperature at this depth remained even more stable, never varying more than 2 degrees from 48 degrees over a 3-week measurement period. He dug a third hole to 7 feet, the practical limit of what one man could excavate safely. The temperature at this depth held absolutely steady at 47 degrees. The earth, below the frost line, which extended approximately 30 inches deep in this climate, maintained consistent temperature year-round. This discovery transformed Amos's understanding of shelter. Above-ground structures experienced whatever temperature nature imposed. A cabin built on the surface had to fight against temperature swings of 80 to 100 degrees between summer heat and winter cold. But a structure built below ground would start from a baseline of approximately 48 degrees. In winter, this meant needing to heat only 10 to 15 degrees to achieve comfortable living temperature. In summer, the earth would provide natural cooling. He traveled to neighboring homesteads during April and May, asking questions about winter survival. He visited Josiah Blackwood, whose family of 5 lived in a cabin similar to the one Amos and Cyrus had built. Josiah reported burning 14 cords of wood during the previous winter. His children had suffered frostbite on their toes, despite being inside the cabin during the coldest nights. His wife had developed a persistent cough from breathing smoke when the fireplace drew poorly. Amos visited 4 other families and heard similar accounts. Everyone had survived, but survival had required constant woodcutting, constant fire tending, and acceptance of interior temperatures that rarely exceeded 40 degrees during cold snaps. Several mentioned that stored food froze inside their cabins. One family reported ice forming on the interior walls during January. This was normal. This was simply how frontier winter worked. No one questioned whether cabins could be built differently because no one had experienced an alternative. Amos questioned everything. He studied how Pennsylvania farmers built root cellars, recalling the underground chambers where his father had stored vegetables. Those cellars never froze, even without heat sources. He remembered spring houses built partially underground to keep milk and butter cool during summer. The principle was identical, using earth as thermal mass to moderate temperature extremes. By June 1843, Amos had developed a specific plan for a semi-subterranean dwelling. He shared this plan with Josiah Blackwood during a chance encounter at the creek. Josiah listened with increasing skepticism as Amos described excavating a chamber into a hillside, building only a front wall above ground, and covering the structure with earth. Josiah's response was immediate and dismissive. Living underground was living like an animal. It was returning to cave dwelling, abandoning civilized construction methods. The earth would collapse and bury anyone foolish enough to sleep in a hole. Water would seep in and create a muddy pit. The idea was impractical, dangerous, and fundamentally wrong. Amos explained the temperature stability he had measured, the reduced heating requirements, the protection from wind. Josiah countered that proper men built proper cabins, above ground, with 4 walls and a peaked roof, the way cabins had been built for generations. He suggested that Cyrus's death had affected Amos's judgment, that grief was causing irrational thinking. Building underground was admitting defeat, giving up on civilized life, descending to the level of prairie dogs and badgers. Word of Amos's plan spread through the scattered homesteading community. Other settlers reacted similarly. They called it Talbot's folly. They joked that he was building his own grave. They questioned his sanity. Several suggested he should return east if he could not handle frontier conditions. The criticism was not mean-spirited, but reflected genuine belief that his concept violated basic principles of proper shelter construction. Cabins belonged above ground. This was self-evident truth that required no justification. The mockery did not deter Amos. He had expected resistance. Frontier communities were deeply conservative regarding construction methods because failure meant death. No one wanted to experiment with shelter design when proven techniques existed, even if those techniques were barely adequate. Innovation in critical survival. Infrastructure seemed reckless when traditional approaches kept most people alive most of the time. He spent 3 weeks planning the specific design. He selected a hillside location with southern exposure, allowing maximum winter sunlight on the entrance. The site featured well-drained soil, important for preventing water accumulation inside the structure. The slope was gentle enough for excavation, but steep enough that a dugout could extend deep into the hillside without requiring excessive digging. He sketched dimensions on paper. The interior would measure 14 feet wide by 18 feet deep, providing slightly more space than standard cabins. The ceiling height would be 7 feet, adequate for standing and movement. He would excavate approximately 4 feet into the hillside, then build earthen berms on the sides and rear to create additional depth. The roof would be a gentle arch covered with earth, distributing weight naturally without requiring elaborate support structures. The entrance would face south, protected by a timber-framed facade with door and small window. This would be the only section fully exposed to weather. Everything else would be earth-sheltered. Amos began excavation in early July 1843. The work was brutally physical. He started by marking the outline of his chamber using stakes and rope, defining a rectangular area 14 feet wide by 18 feet deep. He began digging at the hillside face where his entrance would be located, removing soil and rocks 1 shovel load at a time. The first 3 feet of depth came relatively easily, cutting through topsoil and clay. Below that depth, he encountered harder packed earth mixed with stones that required pickaxe work to break loose before he could shovel them out. He worked from dawn until midday, rested during the hottest afternoon hours, then resumed work until dark. He developed a rhythm of pickaxe strikes followed by shovel removal, piling the excavated earth to the sides where he would eventually use it to build up the earthen roof mound. His hands blistered, then calloused. His back and shoulders ached constantly. The work progressed slowly. After 1 week, he had excavated approximately 1/3 of the total volume. After 2 weeks, half. After 3 weeks, he had dug the full chamber to approximately 4 feet depth at the rear wall, sloping to ground level at the entrance. The excavated chamber revealed the character of the hillside. The soil was primarily clay mixed with sand, providing good structural stability. He found no bedrock, which simplified digging, but meant he needed to ensure adequate drainage to prevent water accumulation. He cut a shallow trench along the rear wall at floor level, angling it toward the entrance to channel any seepage water outward. He packed the floor smooth using a flat stone, creating a hard surface that would not become muddy. The roof structure required careful engineering. He cut lodge pole pines from a nearby timber, selecting relatively straight trunks approximately 6 inches in diameter. He placed these poles across the width of the chamber, spacing them 18 inches apart. The poles rested on the earthen side walls and extended 2 feet beyond on each side. This created the structural framework that would support the earth-covered roof. Over the poles, he laid split planks he had hewn from larger pine trees. The planks ran lengthwise, overlapping like shingles. This created a relatively solid surface that would prevent earth from sifting through while distributing weight across multiple poles. He tested the structure by walking on it carefully before adding earth. The framework flexed slightly but held firm. He then began the laborious process of piling excavated earth back onto the roof structure. He started at the edges and worked toward the center, building up layers gradually to avoid overloading any single section. He added earth in 6-inch layers, allowing each layer to settle before adding the next. The process took 4 full days. When completed, the earth covering measured approximately 3 feet thick at the center, tapering to 2 feet at the edges. He shaped the surface into a gentle curve that would shed water and eventually support snow without excessive accumulation. The front facade required timber construction to create the entrance and support the earth-covered roof where it met the opening. Amos felled 4 straight pine trees, each approximately 14 inches in diameter at the base. He stripped the bark and allowed them to dry for 1 week, understanding that green wood would shrink and warp as it dried, creating gaps he wanted to avoid. While the posts dried, he prepared the materials he would need for the critical task of chinking. Traditional cabin construction used moss and mud for chinking, materials that were free and readily available but performed poorly. Moss compressed over time, creating gaps. Mud cracked when it dried and washed out during rain. Amos had observed these failures throughout the previous winter. He needed something better, something that would create permanent draft-proof seals between logs. He spent 5 days gathering specialized materials. He collected dried grasses from meadow areas, selecting the longest, toughest stems he could find. He cut cattails from marsh areas near the creek, harvesting both the cylindrical seed heads, which contained dense, fluffy material, and the broad leaves, which he dried in the sun. He gathered pine needles from beneath mature pine trees, selecting the longest needles that still retained some flexibility. He collected straw from wild grain grasses growing in open areas. He pulled long strands of fibrous bark from dead cottonwood trees. Each material offered specific properties. Dried grass provided structural body and compressibility. Cattail fluff was incredibly fine and could fill tiny gaps. Pine needles had natural resin that made them water-resistant. Straw added bulk. Bark fibers provided binding strength. Mixing these materials would create chinking that was dense, flexible, weather-resistant, and durable. He constructed the front wall using rough-hewn logs rather than precisely shaped timbers. The logs varied from 8 to 12 inches in diameter, and he deliberately avoided spending time making them uniform. This was pragmatic construction, not fine carpentry. He set 2 vertical posts on either side of the entrance opening, sinking their bases 18 inches into the ground for stability. Between these posts, he stacked horizontal logs to create walls on either side of the door opening. The gaps between logs were substantial, sometimes as wide as 2 inches, where irregular log shapes created voids. This was exactly what Amos wanted. Large gaps would allow for thorough chinking. He worked systematically from bottom to top, stuffing his gathered materials into every space between logs. He mixed the materials as he worked, creating dense plugs of grass, cattail, pine needles, and straw that he forced deep into gaps using a wooden stake as a tamping tool. The chinking process was tedious and time-consuming. Each gap required careful attention to ensure complete filling. He worked the material in tightly, compressing it to eliminate air pockets. The natural fibers interlocked, creating a matrix that would resist pulling out. The pine needle resin helped bind everything together. The chimney represented the most critical engineering challenge of the entire structure. Amos understood that proper draft was essential not just for venting smoke, but for maximizing heat retention and preventing the dangerous backdraft that had plagued his previous cabin. He spent 2 days studying the problem before beginning construction, considering placement, dimensions, and materials with the careful attention that had characterized his entire approach to this project. He decided on center placement rather than the corner location, traditional in frontier cabins. A center chimney would distribute heat more evenly throughout the interior space. More importantly, center placement would position the chimney directly beneath the highest point of his earth-covered roof, ensuring adequate height above the snow accumulation he anticipated during heavy winters. A corner chimney might become buried or blocked by drifting snow. He gathered stones from the creek bed, selecting flat pieces that would stack with minimal gaps. He rejected rounded river rocks that would not create stable courses. The stones he chose were primarily sandstone and granite, both capable of withstanding repeated heating and cooling without cracking. He collected approximately 300 individual stones over 4 days, hauling them to his construction site using a makeshift sled. The fireplace base measured 4 feet wide by 3 feet deep, sized to accommodate logs up to 30 inches long. He dug down 12 inches and filled this foundation with gravel and small stones, creating a stable base that would not settle. Upon this foundation, he began laying stone courses using clay mortar mixed from creek bank clay, sand, and water. The mixture was not as strong as lime mortar, but was adequate for his purpose and cost nothing but labor. He built the fireplace with a sloped back wall that would reflect heat forward into the room rather than allowing it to escape straight up the chimney. This reflected heat design was something he had observed in a well-built tavern fireplace during his journey west. The concept was simple but required careful stone placement to create the correct angle. The back wall started vertical for the first 18 inches, then angled forward at approximately 30 degrees for another 2 feet before transitioning to the vertical chimney. The chimney itself rose through the center of his earth-covered roof. He built it with double-wall construction, leaving a 2-inch air gap between inner and outer stone walls. This air gap would insulate the chimney, keeping the interior surface hot for better draft while preventing the outer surface from becoming dangerously hot where it contacted the roof timbers. He filled the air gap with sand, which provided additional insulation and fire protection. As the chimney rose through the earth-covered roof, Amos carefully cut through the layers he had already placed. He created an opening slightly larger than the chimney diameter, lined it with flat stones, and sealed the gaps with clay. The chimney extended 6 feet above the finished roof surface, high enough to clear anticipated snow accumulation and create proper draft. He capped it with a flat stone that overhung the opening by 4 inches on all sides, preventing rain from entering while allowing smoke to vent. He built a smoke shelf approximately 3 feet up inside the chimney, a horizontal ledge that would catch downdrafts and redirect them upward while also reflecting heat back into the fireplace. The interior fireplace included iron hooks for hanging cooking pots, traded from Silas Hartwell for 2 beaver pelts. The door required the same meticulous attention Amos had applied to every other aspect of his dugout. He had observed too many frontier doors that were simply planks held together with crosspieces, hung on leather hinges that froze and cracked, fitted so poorly that wind whistled through gaps even when barred. His door would be different. It would be a genuine barrier between interior warmth and exterior cold, engineered to eliminate the heat loss that had killed Cyrus. He selected a mature pine tree and felled it specifically for door construction. From this single tree, he split planks approximately 3 inches thick, working the wood while it was still green and easier to shape. He cut 6 planks, each 7 feet long and 10 inches wide. These would form the door itself. He shaped the edges carefully, using a draw knife, creating tongue and groove joints where each plank would interlock with its neighbor. The tongue and groove design meant the planks would not simply sit side by side with gaps between them but would mechanically connect, creating a single solid unit. He assembled the planks on flat ground, fitting the tongues into the grooves with patient adjustment until all 6 planks locked together tightly. The resulting door measured 7 feet tall by 5 feet wide and weighed approximately 90 pounds. Its thickness and weight would provide both insulation value and resistance to forced entry by wind or animals. He reinforced the interior face with 2 diagonal wooden braces running corner to corner in an X pattern, fastened with wooden pegs driven through holes he had drilled with a hand auger. The hinges posed a challenge. Leather hinges were inadequate. He needed something stronger and more weather-resistant. Silas Hartwell had provided 2 iron strap hinges, each 18 inches long and half an inch thick. These hinges were designed to support heavy doors on barns and required proper installation to function correctly. Amos mortised the hinges into both the door edge and the door frame, cutting rectangular pockets so the hinges sat flush rather than being simply screwed to the surface. He secured them with iron pins that went completely through the doorframe logs, creating connections that could not be torn free without destroying the logs themselves. The window opening measured 12 inches square positioned high on the front wall approximately 6 feet above the interior floor. This placement allowed light and ventilation while minimizing heat loss. The small size meant the window contributed minimal thermal weakness to the structure. He covered the opening with oiled paper he had purchased during his last supply trip to the trading post, stretching it tight across a wooden frame that could be removed from inside if needed. He built interior furnishings with the same attention to efficiency. A sleeping platform ran along one wall, raised 2 feet off the earth floor to avoid cold air that would settle near ground level. Shelves mounted on the walls held supplies. A simple table and single chair occupied the center space. The total interior volume was deliberately compact, approximately 1,400 cubic feet, small enough that a modest fire would heat it effectively, but large enough for comfortable long-term habitation. Amos moved into his completed dugout on September 23, 1843. He hauled his possessions from the old cabin in 3 trips, carrying supplies, tools, bedding, and the few personal items he owned. The interior of the dugout felt strange after living in conventional above-ground cabins his entire life. The earth walls created a sense of enclosure that was both comforting and slightly oppressive. The ceiling, though adequate at 7 feet, felt lower than it actually was. The single small window provided less light than he had anticipated, making the interior dim even during bright afternoon hours. He built his first fire in the new stone fireplace on the evening of his move. He arranged kindling carefully, struck sparks with flint and steel, and watched the flames catch and grow. The chimney drew perfectly. Smoke rose straight up without any backflow into the living space. Within 20 minutes, he could feel warmth radiating from the stone fireplace back wall, exactly as he had intended when designing the angled surface. The temperature response was remarkable. The small fire, using perhaps 1/8 the wood he would have burned in his old cabin, created noticeable warmth within the compact space. After 1 hour, the interior temperature had risen to approximately 60 degrees, comfortable enough that he removed his heavy coat. The earth walls, which had felt cool to the touch when he first entered, began absorbing heat. He could feel warmth radiating back from the packed earth surface near the fireplace. He let the fire burn down to coals before sleeping. During the night, the interior temperature dropped only slightly. When he woke at dawn, the dugout felt noticeably warmer than the exterior air. He checked Cyrus's thermometer. Outside temperature was 38 degrees. Inside temperature was 52 degrees. The structure had retained heat throughout the night with no active fire, something his previous cabin had never achieved. Despite this initial success, doubt plagued him. September weather was mild. The real test would come during deep winter, during the kind of cold that had killed Cyrus. Would the earth walls continue to provide insulation when exterior temperatures dropped to 20 or 30 below zero? Would the snow load he anticipated actually provide additional insulation, or would it simply crush his roof structure? Would moisture accumulation inside the earth-sheltered space create mold or make the interior uninhabitable? He had no answers to these questions. He had built something unprecedented in his experience, based on observations and reasoning that seemed sound but remained unproven. Josiah Blackwood visited 3 days after Amos moved in. He examined the dugout with obvious skepticism, walking around the earth-covered mound, peering at the chimney, and finally stepping inside to view the interior. His assessment was blunt. The structure looked like a tomb. Living in a hole might work for September, but winter would reveal its failures. The earth would become damp and cold. The roof would collapse under snow weight. Amos would be digging himself out by November, or more likely, abandoning this foolish experiment and building a proper cabin before he froze to death like Cyrus had. The first significant test came in late October, when an early winter storm dropped 14 inches of snow across the valley over 2 days. Temperatures fell to 18 degrees. Wind gusted to 30 miles per hour, creating drifts against every exposed surface. Amos watched from inside his dugout as snow accumulated on his earth-covered roof, burying the mound under an additional layer of white insulation. The roof held without any sign of stress. The arched design distributed the snow weight naturally across the supporting poles. Inside, the temperature remained stable. With a small morning fire and another in the evening, the interior temperature stayed between 55 and 62 degrees throughout the storm. He burned approximately 1/4 of a cord of wood during the 5-day period that included the storm and its immediate aftermath. In his previous cabin, he would have burned a full cord during the same period and still experienced interior temperatures in the 30s and 40s. The stone chimney continued drawing perfectly despite the snow accumulation. The 6-foot height above the roof surface kept the opening clear. Even when drifting snow covered portions of the roof to depths of 3 feet, the chimney remained functional. Amos realized his center placement decision had been correct. A corner chimney would have been buried by the drifts that formed on the downwind side of his structure. He began systematic temperature tracking. Each morning and evening, he recorded interior and exterior temperatures using Cyrus's thermometer. The data revealed patterns that confirmed his design principles. When exterior temperatures dropped, interior temperatures declined much more slowly. When exterior temperatures rose, interior temperatures increased gradually rather than spiking. The thermal mass of the surrounding Earth was acting as a buffer, absorbing excess heat during warm periods and releasing stored heat during cold periods. November brought sustained cold. Exterior temperatures remained below freezing for 18 consecutive days, dropping to 0 or below on 7 nights. Amos maintained comfortable interior conditions with 2 fires daily, each burning for approximately 3 hours. His wood consumption averaged 1 cord per month, a dramatic reduction from the 4 to 5 cords monthly he had burned in his conventional cabin during the previous winter. The natural chinking performed excellently. No drafts penetrated the carefully stuffed gaps between logs on the front wall. The dried grass, cattail fluff, and pine needles had compressed into dense plugs that effectively sealed every opening. The door fit tightly in its rabbeted frame, creating a weather-tight seal. The small window, covered with oiled paper, allowed diffused light without significant heat loss. By early December, Amos had confidence in his design. The dugout was warmer, required less fuel, and provided more consistent interior conditions than any frontier cabin he had experienced. But confidence was not proof. The real test would come during deep winter, during the kind of extreme cold and sustained blizzard conditions that had killed Cyrus. That test was coming. Weather signs suggested a brutal winter ahead. December 1843 brought ominous indicators that experienced frontiersmen recognized as warnings of severe winter ahead. Animal behavior changed noticeably. Deer moved to lower elevations earlier than normal. Squirrels gathered food with unusual intensity. Birds that typically remained through winter departed southward in large flocks. The fur on rabbits and other small game grew thicker than usual. Beaver built their lodges with extra layers of sticks and mud. These signs, accumulated over generations of observation, suggested that nature itself was preparing for something extraordinary. The human inhabitants of the valley responded to these warnings. Josiah Blackwood and his family cut and split 8 cords of wood, stacking it under cover near their cabin. Other homesteaders stockpiled similar quantities. Wood cutting dominated every family's activity during December. The sound of axes and splitting mauls echoed through the valley from dawn until dark. Men who had initially planned to cut wood as needed throughout winter revised their approach, recognizing that severe weather might trap them in their cabins for extended periods. Food preservation received similar attention. Every family had slaughtered at least 1 hog during November, preserving the meat through smoking and salting. Dried beans, cornmeal, flour, salt pork, and other staples were stockpiled in quantities intended to last until spring. Root vegetables were stored in underground cellars. Families who could afford the expense purchased additional supplies during December trips to the trading post, knowing that winter storms might make travel impossible for months. Cabin maintenance became urgent. Homesteaders re-chinked gaps in their log walls, knowing that chinking would fail during extreme cold. They repaired doors and hinges. They checked roof integrity, adding additional bark or sod layers where needed. They examined their fireplaces and chimneys, removing creosote buildup and repairing damaged mortar. These preparations were routine before every winter, but the urgency in December 1843 exceeded normal caution. Amos prepared differently. His wood supply was modest by valley standards, only 3 cords stacked near his dugout entrance. This quantity seemed inadequate to his neighbors, who assumed he would run out by February and be forced to cut wood during the coldest months, a dangerous and exhausting task. But Amos understood his heating requirements better than they did. 3 cords would be sufficient for 4 months based on his consumption rates during October and November. His food supplies were adequate but not excessive. He had smoked venison, dried beans, cornmeal, flour, salt, coffee, and a small quantity of sugar. He had gathered wild rose hips in autumn for vitamin C, understanding from frontier medical knowledge that scurvy was a risk during long winters without fresh food. His preparations were calculated, rather than excessive, based on actual needs rather than fear. On December 20th, Silas Hartwell stopped at Amos's dugout during a trip up the valley. He examined the earth-covered structure and asked about Amos's winter preparations. The wood supply concerned him. 3 cords would never last until spring. Amos would freeze or exhaust himself cutting wood in deep snow. Silas offered to sell additional cut wood on credit, payment due after spring trapping season. Amos declined politely, explaining his heating efficiency calculations. Silas left, shaking his head, certain that stubbornness would cost Amos dearly. The blizzard arrived on January 7, 1844, announced by a pressure drop that made Amos's ears ache and a sky that turned the color of iron. The first snow began falling around midday, large flakes descending vertically in still air. Within 2 hours, the wind arrived from the northwest, transforming gentle snowfall into horizontal sheets of white that reduced visibility to arm's length. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 3 hours. By nightfall, the thermometer outside Amos's dugout registered 8 degrees below zero, and the wind was gusting hard enough to make the needle vibrate. Amos had experienced winter storms before, but this was different in character and intensity. The wind did not gust and calm in normal patterns. It sustained a steady howl that continued hour after hour without respite. Snow accumulated with frightening speed. By the evening of the first day, drifts against the south-facing entrance of his dugout had reached 4 feet deep. He used a shovel to clear the area immediately in front of his door, but within an hour the drift rebuilt itself. He stopped fighting it and retreated inside. The dugout's performance during the storm's first night exceeded his expectations. Despite wind that shook trees and tore branches from pines across the valley, the interior remained absolutely calm. No drafts penetrated the natural chinking. No wind sound reached him except as muffled background noise, quieter than wind sounds he had experienced inside conventional cabins during moderate storms. The small evening fire he built heated the space to 60 degrees within an hour. When he let it die to coals before sleeping, the temperature dropped overnight to only 53 degrees by dawn. The second day brought intensified conditions. Temperature continued falling, reaching 18 below zero by afternoon. Snow accumulation accelerated. Amos could no longer see beyond the front window. Everything was white, driven snow that created complete disorientation. He did not attempt to go outside. There was no purpose that justified exposure to such conditions. He remained inside, maintaining a small fire, eating cold food to conserve fuel, and monitoring the interior temperature. The dugout remained comfortable. The earth walls radiated gentle warmth absorbed during previous fires. The snow accumulating on The roof provided additional insulation rather than threatening structural collapse. The third day brought the coldest temperatures. Amos's thermometer, checked through a small opening he cleared at the window, registered 29 degrees below zero at dawn. The interior temperature that morning was 51 degrees with only coals remaining from the previous evening's fire. This differential, 80 degrees between exterior and interior with no active heating, demonstrated the effectiveness of earth-sheltered construction in a way that no theoretical explanation could match. He built a small fire for warmth and to heat water for coffee. The stone fireplace radiated heat efficiently. The chimney continued drawing perfectly, despite snow depth on the roof that he estimated at 5 feet or more based on what he could observe through the window. The center placement and extended height kept the chimney opening clear. Smoke vented normally. The storm continued through the 4th, 5th, and 6th days. Wind never stopped. Temperature never rose above zero. Snow continued falling, sometimes heavily, sometimes lightly, but never ceasing entirely. Amos lost track of whether it was day or night, except by checking his pocket watch. The constant white darkness outside made time meaningless. He slept when tired, ate when hungry, maintained his small fires, and waited for the storm to end while remaining completely comfortable in his underground sanctuary. By the 7th day of the blizzard, Amos had burned approximately half a cord of wood, maintaining 2 small fires daily that kept interior temperature between 55 and 62 degrees. This level of comfort required minimal effort. He spent perhaps 1 hour daily splitting kindling, feeding fires, and managing coals. The rest of his time passed in reading the single book he owned, a Bible he had carried from Pennsylvania, and in simply waiting while the storm exhausted itself against a structure designed to ignore its fury. The earth walls had become noticeably warm to the touch near the fireplace. The thermal mass was fully charged, storing heat from his fires and radiating it continuously throughout the interior space. Even the rear wall, farthest from the fireplace, felt neutral rather than cold. The floor, which was packed earth, remained at constant temperature, never freezing despite exterior temperatures that had dropped to 34 below zero on the night of the 6th day. This was ground temperature stability working exactly as Amos had predicted based on his spring excavation experiments. The snow accumulation on the roof had become massive, based on what little he could observe through his small window during brief moments when wind patterns allowed visibility. The snow depth over his dugout appeared to be 6 to 8 feet. The curved roof profile prevented drifts from building to dangerous heights, but the sheer weight of snow covering the structure would have collapsed a conventional cabin roof. His pole and earth construction distributed the load naturally. He felt no concern about structural failure. The chimney remained functional throughout. The double wall construction with sand insulation kept the inner surface hot enough to maintain draft, while the outer surface remained cool enough not to ignite the roof timbers where they passed near the stone. The 6-foot extension above the roof kept the opening clear, even as snow buried everything else. White smoke rose into white sky, the only visible evidence that someone was alive beneath the accumulated snow. On the 8th day, the wind finally diminished. Snowfall reduced to occasional flurries. Temperature rose to 10 below zero, which felt almost warm compared to the previous week. Amos cleared the drift blocking his door and stepped outside for the first time in 7 days. The landscape was unrecognizable. Everything was buried. Trees were visible only as dark verticals emerging from an unbroken white surface. His dugout had disappeared entirely beneath the snow, except for the chimney rising from what appeared to be a natural hillside drift. He stood in the clear, cold air and realized something profound. He had just survived the worst winter storm he had ever experienced while burning minimal wood, never feeling uncomfortably cold, never worrying about structural collapse, and never doubting that his shelter would protect him. Somewhere in the valley below, His neighbors had fought for survival. He wondered how many had succeeded. Amos began the descent into the valley on January 15th, 3 days after the blizzard ended. Snow depth made travel extremely difficult. In open areas, the surface had crusted enough to support his weight, but near timber, the snow remained soft and deep. He wore snowshoes he had crafted the previous winter, broad frames woven with rawhide that distributed his weight and allowed him to stay atop the snow rather than sinking with each step. Even with snowshoes, the journey that normally took 1 hour required 4. He reached Josiah Blackwood's homestead first. From a distance, the cabin appeared intact, buried to the roofline in drifted snow, but structurally sound. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating survivors inside. He called out before approaching. Josiah emerged from the cabin, moving slowly like an old man, though he was only 36 years old. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. He stared at Amos with an expression mixing relief and something else, perhaps resentment that Amos appeared well-fed and strong, while Josiah looked half-dead. Josiah's account of the previous week was grim. The blizzard had nearly killed his entire family. Their cabin had leaked cold air through dozens of gaps, despite the rechinking they had done in December. The door had allowed wind to penetrate around its frame. The fireplace had consumed wood at terrifying rates, yet barely kept interior temperature above freezing. They had burned 6 cords during the 8-day storm, far more than they had anticipated needing for an entire month. They had burned furniture when cut wood ran low. They had slept in all their clothes under every blanket they owned and still suffered from cold that made sleep nearly impossible. Josiah's youngest child, a daughter of 4 years, had developed frostbite on her toes despite never leaving the cabin. His wife had a persistent cough from breathing smoke when the fireplace drew poorly during wind shifts. They had survived, but just barely, and their wood supply was now critically depleted with 2 months of winter remaining. Josiah asked if Amos could spare any firewood. Amos agreed to provide half a cord, though this would reduce his own reserves uncomfortably. He continued down the valley, checking other homesteads. The pattern repeated with variations. Every family had burned far more wood than anticipated. Every cabin had proven inadequate against the extreme cold. Most families showed signs of cold-related illness or injury. The Hendricks family had abandoned their cabin on the 4th day of the blizzard and walked 3 miles through the storm to shelter with relatives whose cabin was slightly better built. It was a desperate gamble that could have killed them all, but their own cabin had become uninhabitable. At Hiram Cofield's homestead, Amos found tragedy. Smoke rose from the chimney, but no one responded to his calls. He forced the door open and found the cabin interior destroyed. The family had burned everything combustible: furniture, interior wallboards they had pried loose, floor planking. The destruction suggested absolute desperation. He found Hiram and his wife frozen in their bed, wrapped together under insufficient blankets. Their 2 children, boys aged 8 and 6, were frozen nearby. The family had simply gone to sleep and not awakened. The cold had taken them quietly. Amos helped bury the Cofield family on January 18th, when enough men had recovered sufficient strength to assist with the grim task. The ground was frozen solid, making grave digging impossible. They built a stone cairn over the 4 bodies on a hillside overlooking the valley, marking it with a wooden cross carved with names and dates. 7 people had died in the valley during the blizzard. The Cofield family of 4, an elderly trapper named Carson, who lived alone, and 2 members of the Hendricks family who had attempted to reach relatives but died of exposure within sight of their destination. The survivors wanted to understand how Amos had fared so differently. They came to his dugout in small groups over the following weeks, examining the earth-covered structure they had previously mocked. Josiah Blackwood arrived on January 20th and asked for a tour of the interior. Amos showed him the compact space, explained the thermal mass principle, demonstrated how the natural chinking sealed all gaps, and described the wood consumption rates he had experienced during the blizzard. Josiah listened with the attention of a man confronting evidence that contradicted everything he had believed about proper shelter construction. Josiah asked specific questions. How deep was the excavation? How were the roof poles sized and spaced? What materials composed the chinking? How was the chimney constructed to maintain draft under deep snow? Amos answered each question thoroughly, withholding nothing. He had no proprietary interest in his design. If others could build similar structures and avoid the suffering his neighbors had experienced, that was entirely positive. By February, 3 families had begun planning earth-sheltered cabins for construction as soon as spring allowed excavation. Josiah Blackwood would build on a hillside near his current cabin. The Hendricks family would construct a dugout at a new location with better southern exposure. A trapper named Morrison, who had survived the blizzard but lost 3 fingers to frostbite, wanted to build before the next winter. They asked Amos to advise on their designs. He agreed, offering to help with excavation and construction in exchange for assistance with his own spring planting. Rebecca Hartwell arrived in late February. She was Silas Hartwell's niece, 23 years old, who had traveled from Ohio to live with her uncle after her parents died of cholera. She had heard about Amos's survival during the blizzard and about the innovative shelter he had built. She came ostensibly to see the dugout but stayed to talk with Amos about his plans, his past, and his future in the valley. They discovered compatible temperaments and mutual attraction. By March, Amos had asked her to marry him. She accepted, conditional on him expanding his dugout to include a separate sleeping room and better kitchen area. He began that excavation in April. The wedding took place in June 1844. Josiah Blackwood served as witness. The ceremony was brief and practical, conducted by a circuit-riding minister who passed through the valley twice yearly. Rebecca moved into the expanded dugout and immediately began improving it with curtains, better shelving, and organized storage that made the compact space feel more like a home than a survival shelter. The summer of 1844 saw 4 earth-sheltered cabins under construction in the valley. Amos spent significant time helping neighbors with excavation and structural design. The techniques spread through direct observation and teaching rather than through any formal documentation. Each builder adapted the basic principles to their specific site and resources, creating variations that maintained the core concept while reflecting individual circumstances and preferences. Josiah Blackwood completed his dugout by late August. He excavated deeper than Amos had, creating nearly 6 feet of earth cover on the sides and rear. His structure featured 2 rooms separated by a partial wall. The front room held the fireplace and living area. The rear room provided sleeping space for his family. His wood consumption during the winter of 1844 to 45 dropped to approximately 1/4 of what he had burned in his conventional cabin the previous year. Enoch Varner, a traveling trapper who had survived the blizzard in a snow cave, visited the valley in autumn 1844. He examined the earth-sheltered cabins with professional interest. Trappers were always seeking better shelter solutions for remote camps. The dugout concept solved multiple problems: warmth, wind protection, reduced visibility to potential threats, and minimal wood requirements in areas where fuel might be scarce. Enoch carried the technique west into Wyoming territory, building several earth-sheltered structures at his trapline camps over the following years. By 1847, variations of earth-sheltered construction had appeared in mountain valleys across Montana and Wyoming territories. Not every settler adopted the approach. Many remained committed to conventional above-ground log cabins, either from preference, skepticism, or simply because their building sites were unsuitable for excavation. But those who faced the most severe winter conditions increasingly recognized the advantages of working with earth rather than fighting against winter from exposed above-ground positions. Luther Pennock, a pioneer who had seen Josiah's dugout during a trading visit, built an earth-sheltered homestead in Dakota Territory in 1849. His structure survived a blizzard that destroyed 3 conventional cabins in his area. Word spread throughout the northern frontier. Lives were saved during subsequent harsh winters because people built shelters that used thermal mass and earth insulation rather than relying solely on wood fuel and optimism. Amos and Rebecca raised 3 children in their expanded dugout. The structure provided comfortable living space through 18 winters. Amos eventually built a conventional frame house in 1860 when the valley became settled enough to support a sawmill, but he maintained the dugout as storage and emergency shelter. It remained structurally sound after nearly 2 decades. The principle Amos had demonstrated that intelligent design could solve problems that strength and stubbornness could not, became embedded in frontier wisdom. Building underground was no longer considered living like an animal, but recognized as sophisticated engineering that worked with natural thermal principles. Earth provided insulation and thermal mass that above-ground construction could not match. Small spaces heated efficiently. Careful attention to draft elimination made more difference than massive wood piles. Amos died in 1873 at age 58. The dugout remained, gradually settling back into the hillside as the timber framing aged. By 1890, it was barely distinguishable from the east. Natural landscape except for the stone chimney rising from a grass-covered mound. But the legacy was not in that single structure. It was in the dozens of earth-sheltered cabins built across frontier territories. It was in the families who survived brutal winters because they understood thermal mass. It was in the quiet knowledge that frontier innovation came from careful observation and willingness to question traditional approaches. Amos Talbot proved that one man, facing tragedy and determined to prevent its repetition, could develop a solution that saved lives. Engineering triumphed where heroism failed, and those lessons spread across the frontier through the simple power of techniques that worked when needed most.